Hi, everyone. Welcome to our discussion of Chapter 4 and the key ideas that I want to extract so that you get a well-rounded picture of the period of history that we're talking about. And I certainly hope you're getting that. If you are not, if there are certain parts of the lectures that are not working for you, please feel free to reach out to me during my office hours. I'd be really happy to hear from you. Um, I'll also throw it open for discussion when we have drill down sessions on Fridays. And just a reminder of some of the rules. You have to do 10 drill down sessions and 10 accompanying drill down activities to get all points for that exercise. And you need to keep viewing these lectures in order to get credit for that as well. So this, of course, is a very different way of doing things in a Purchase College history classroom. And I hope you know that when we're up close and personal, there's a lot of dynamic energy, but we have to deal with the hand that we've been dealt at present. And I thank you for coming along with it and for doing your best. So I want to give you a moment to look at the the Chapter 4 material that we're going to be discussing. So why don't you take a moment, and if you need to, copy down these terms. And of course, in the process of viewing these lectures, you can always pause them and go back to them later. And in the process of compiling them, I sometimes have to do so as well, because I have to kind of recalibrate, so to speak. So take a moment, mark those down. Clearly, we're moving very fast through the subject matter. Okay, and now we'll move on. We ended last week's chapter discussion. Whoops, I did not mean to do that. I meant to just get the click to add title out of the way. Pardon me. There we go. Okay, we ended our discussion last week in Chapter 3 with the Consumer Revolution. And just to clarify what that was the real refinement and apotheosis of what we call mercantilism. The idea that a nation would be a strong one if it kept all of the means for its wealth within its borders. So, in the colonial world, and specifically in the English example, that meant that the English colonies, of which, please remember, there are 39, there aren't just 13, there are 39. And it's a number that's constantly changing because of contests with other Europeans. But in these English colonies, there is a movement of raw materials back to the mother country, and those raw materials are then processed into finished goods, and they're sent back to North America. They are also sent to Africa for trade, and they feed the trade in enslaved captive Africans who are then going to be used as enslaved people in the New World. So this is a system in which a lot of people benefit, except the people, obviously, who are kidnapped and sold into slavery. And we're going to talk about their story in more enriched terms during the course of this lecture. But just to clarify, what happens is England gets richer because its business in manufacturing really grows. We tend to think of something called the Industrial Revolution as being a thing of the 1800s, being a 19th century thing. Well, in much of Europe, it wasn't. It starts as early as the late 1600s. It only becomes the Industrial Revolution that we know in America in the 19th century. But they already have fairly large scale manufacturing. It employs a lot of people, and it keeps a lot of people home in England and working, and that's going to be good for the English economy. What it also means is that goods can be produced more cheaply, and the boats that move them back and forth from England to America move more quickly than ever and more predictably than ever, and they provide cheap goods for the Americans. So something very special is going on with this trade relationship between English colonists, free English colonists, I should specify, and the mother country of England. The people who live in the colonies are living lives of greater material comfort on average than their counterparts in England would be. Now, their counterparts in England can vote for the most part. They have a political voice and they are fully recognized subjects of the English king. Whereas in the Americas, it's not quite the same thing. They have these little elected legislatures that I'll talk about in a few minutes, and they have a very different relationship. They are not really treated as full subjects. But they look like fuller subjects, if you will, because they live lives of greater material comfort. And this is going to set up a real disconnect between the people of England and people of the Americas, and that is going to spill over into that conflict we know as the American Revolution, which we'll talk about next week. For now, however, I want you to know that Atlantic trade is governed by something called the Navigation Acts. And these are a series of acts that the English put in place to govern their trade. And basically what they say is that certain raw materials that come from the New World, things such as tobacco and sugar and certain types of lumber, have to sail to an English port in an English registered vessel with a certain percentage of English sailors. And that's for a very specific reason. That is because that the English want to make sure that trade enriches them as well as their colonists. Now, the colonists don't like these navigation acts, and as I said, there's a whole series of them over the course of a century, and they keep kind of tightening England's grip, beg your pardon, on colonial commodities. The colonists don't like them, but the colonists do something very special to resist them, and that is called smuggling. So they basically will, in any way they possibly can, trade with other Europeans in ways that avoid these rules about trade that are coming from England. And that's because they can make more money that way. Do the English know they're doing this? Yes, they do. They absolutely do know this. But the Americans have governed themselves for the most part, taken care of themselves. They haven't cost England a lot of time and a lot of money, and England still is making money. So what do the English do? Something called salutary neglect. And that means if the Americans continue to pay lip service, or at least partially abide by these rules, and the English still make money at their trade, then they're going to turn a blind eye to the smuggling. They're not going to care too much about it. They're going to allow it to continue to go on. And that is going to be something that, again, will change during the course of the 18th century and lead in part to the American Revolution. But we're getting there. We're just amassing the information and the factors that are going to lead to the American Revolution. I can tell you one thing that did not lead to it, and that wasn't some sort of abstract idea that people wanted to be free. It's much more complicated than that. So we'll be getting to those complications during the course of our semester together. I want to point out here the fact that this green section here represents the 13 American colonies. And we've talked about the evolution of some of them, We specifically looked at Pennsylvania. We talked a little bit about the Dutch in the New World that will eventually become New York. We talked about New England and the rise of the Chesapeake. I want to point out here, this goes all the way up to Maine, and Maine was not an original colony. It was part of Massachusetts. Why do I know that so well? My first book was on early Maine, which would have been Massachusetts. So it's a topic of mine. But I do want to kind of fill in the rest of the 13 colony picture with the last of the 13 colonies that rebel against England, the coastal ones of North America, to come online. And that would be colony of Georgia. And some of you might have heard in your previous academic lives that Georgia was like America's Australia, that it was a penal colony. And that's not quite the case. It was founded for people who go to prison. But in England in the 17th and the 18th centuries, people who are in debt to others and don't pay their debts go to a special kind of prison called debtor's prison. So they are not violent criminals or insurrectionaries or anything like that. Sorry about that. But they are people who are in debt to others. And if you get into debt and then you can't pay your debts back, that's really kind of in its own right considered a pretty severe moral failing in 18th century England. You're just not, you're not a criminal, but you're not an ideal citizen either. You're somebody who's kind of broken in some way. And basically, if you went to debtor's prison, your whole family went with you, your property was confiscated frequently, and you had to live in these really kind of just awful conditions in prisons like the Marshalsea, while you went out to work and attempted to pay back the rest of your debt with the hope that you would eventually be set free and be able to resume your life. So even though they are not criminals per se, debtors are considered people who are somehow defective in English society. But they are people whose defects some enlightened people believe can be remedied. So there is a movement in Parliament to found a colony that will be specifically for debtors. And these debtors will go to this colony named for King George II of England. They will go to this colony named in his honor. And they will basically work there, and through hard work and through making money for the empire, they will redeem themselves. They will become model citizens once again. And here are two kind of contemporary images of what one hoped Georgia would be, that you would have a lot of people hard at work on a regular basis, involved in industries such as farming and iron making and household crafts that would then kind of add to Atlantic trade and make Georgia a productive place and make the people who lived there productive as well. There's one key element to Georgia, and that is that no slavery was initially allowed. And that is not because the founders had any concern for enslaved people. They didn't. They were just as capable of these racist beliefs about kidnapped Africans as everybody else. But they believed that it would be morally degrading for the debtors themselves for two reasons. First of all, they would not want to work. So if they were allowed to have slaves, then they would not be doing the work themselves, which would defeat the entire purpose for the colony. Second of all, if others who couldn't afford slaves saw slaves doing work for their fellow colonists, they would be demoralized and they wouldn't want to work. So it's really for very cynical reasons that the Georgians are not allowed to have slaves. But what very quickly happens, and I'm going to come over to this map, is that that dictate just completely goes out the window. The main reason is Georgia comes right up against South Carolina. South Carolina starts to get filled up with other farmers. Therefore, those South Carolinians are going to start going over the border to this new state of Georgia, and they are going to bring their slaves with them. Their enslaved people, pardon, with them. Why didn't anyone stop them? Because nobody wanted to stop them. They really want settlers in Georgia. And they want settlers in Georgia for a very important reason. The Spanish are here in Florida, and they are looking at Georgia with a very unfriendly eye. So it's figured the more English colonists who are in Georgia, the better. And this dictate against slavery is very quickly not followed. The other thing, and it points to a problem with our Atlantic world, is communication and execution of the law are very, very slow. They have to cross the Atlantic Ocean for the most part. Who's going to follow the rules? Who's going to force the rules to be followed? Well, the fact is, no one is really going to do that if it doesn't suit colonial interests. So there in Georgia, we have a complex set of problems that arise almost from the very beginning. This desire to keep slavery out, and very quickly, it shows that there are limitations to enforcing the rules in a colony if you have to rely on England for its feedback and for its enforcement. And also really severe problems with associating people of color with the very brutal, hardest work in the colonial world. And that is going to lead to a very tragically robust racism, which is present in just about every corner of the English New World. So let's move to a topic that has us address that a bit. A lot of students tell me they are very surprised to find out that slavery, or the forced enslavement, chattel slavery, which is the term that we refer to it as, exists in every corner of the colonial world. And I'm talking about places like Nova Scotia, which is part of Canada, and you would think, well, slavery wouldn't exist there because they don't have plantation crops, or they don't seem to have this virulent legacy of racism that we find in other parts of the colonial world that then become the United States and actually try to break off from the United States over the topic of slavery. But indeed, enslavement exists everywhere. You find it in Nova Scotia, you find it in Boston, you find it in the New Jersey farming countryside, you find it in New York, in profusion everywhere. As a matter of fact, during the colonial period, 1 in 7 people living on Manhattan Island, what had been known as Mannahatta or Manhattan's Island, depending on who the conquerors were, is living in human bondage. And as we can see here in this little image of New Amsterdam or New Amsterdam, Dutch settlers coming over to the New World, enjoying its bounty, and part of that bounty is the enslavement of other humans who are going to be doing heavy labor for them and increasing their wealth. For those of you who live in Westchester County, there is Phillipsburg Manor in nearby Sleepy Hollow. And I will actually send this out to the class, but Phillipsburg Manor interprets slavery in the North, or in one corner of the North, where people lived very different lives. They're not bringing in those plantation crops of rice and tobacco that they are in places like Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and eventually Georgia, but they are doing all sorts of diverse work. And that's going to be a hallmark of slavery north of Maryland. Enslaved people tend to live in smaller concentrations. They're not living on those big commercial farms that we call plantations. For the most part, enslaved people are living in cities or in the countryside right outside of a city. They are living in small groups where they might be the only enslaved person as part of a household, or they might be one of two or three or even five, but it's really quite rare to find even large farms with more than 10 enslaved people owned by the slaveholder, which, by the way, slaveholder is the term we will be using instead of master during the course of this semester. Master connotes mastery. It normally has a positive connotation that you're a master of something, a master's degree, whatever. These are slave owners or slave holders, and that is really the more appropriate title to apply to them. So we will do that. And there are some, now I'm not talking at all about psychological ramifications of living in the state of enslavement, but I am going to talk about some of the material or physical benefits to life and how they change depending on where you were. So an enslaved person in Boston might have a life, was more than likely to have a life that looked like this. They lived in the household with their slaveholder and their slaveholder's family. They would often eat at the same table after they had served it, and then they would clean it afterward, but sometimes with other members of the household, white as well as people of color. They would live in the home. They would do diverse types of work. So sometimes they would learn a trade such as blacksmithing, or furniture making, or hairdressing, tailoring of clothing, shoemaking. So enslaved people were exposed to a variety of different types of work. And if they mastered their trades, they sometimes were given some proceeds of their work by their slaveholders. The chances of finding someone to share your life with who had similar characteristics to you were materially diminished, though, because you're seeing fewer and fewer people of color like you. So at their peak, 4% of the population is enslaved in a city like Boston and its environs. That's a pretty small percentage. It amounts to a lot of individual people with a lot of individual stories, but it's a small percentage. Transfer that to living in a place like South Carolina, where by the time you get to about 1740, 60% of the population of that English colony is living in human bondage and comprised of people of African origin or some African ethnicity. And as we know, those ethnicities are vast and various, more vast and various than you would even find in Europe. So you lived in harsher conditions. The climate is more punitive, and the work is less personal because you were, for the most part, not living in the home of your slaveholder. You're living with fellow enslaved people. And yet that offered you potentially the worldly advantage, the material advantage of making new friends, developing relationships that last over time, things that we call fictive kinships. So many of you, and I and my daughter and my husband, everybody in our family, had people in our lives who weren't related to us, but we called them aunt and uncle. So they are people important to you who have a relationship that echoes family. That is a fictive kinship, and that becomes very, very common in the plantation colonies of the South, what we call the South. So in the Chesapeake colonies of Maryland and Virginia, and then the lower South colonies of both Carolinas and of Georgia. So there's that difference, that quantitative difference there. You could live a physically more comfortable life if you were enslaved in the North, but you may not have the psychological comforts of living with people of your choice, making relationships of your choice, based on the fact that you're living around a lot of people who are in the same situation as you. Slavery will eventually die out in the North. It will actually be ended in some new states after the American Revolution because it's seen as antithetical to this new republic that people are building. And in some places, it's going to thrive and tragically grow stronger and even more widespread. Kidnapped Africans came from diverse regions of Africa itself. And that diversity is reflected in their religious practices, which are vast and varied and very complex, and demonstrate the diversity of the enslaved. So, because religion and the study of religion is often a very valuable flashlight, if you will, into the lives of early people, or camera obscura, whatever you choose to use. It's a good thing to look at in the context of this course. So what I have shown you here is several artifacts that come from religious people who were kidnapped and enslaved. It's very important to note that there is a long tradition of Christianity in Africa and a short tradition of Christianity as well. This is a bronze cross that was of, or bronze crucifix rather, that was of African manufacture. And it comes most specifically from the West Coastal Kingdom of Congo, which became adopted an African inflected form of Catholicism in the late 16th century under a queen named Queen Jinga, who had a dream which was very important in her previous religious traditions, and that, almost like Constantine in Rome, directed her to bring her people, if you will, to Catholicism. What comes out of that is a type of Catholicism that is a mixture between pre-existing African religions, animism, we would call it, and Catholicism, which we know as syncretism. And that is a new religious belief that emerges from the combination of two or more pre-existing beliefs. And if you take this Catholicism from the west coast of Africa, mix it with African animism, which is a variety of religious beliefs that have a spiritual dimension to them, and that spirit is applied to the natural world, so water, animals, living things, geographical references, and then put that together with Native American religion, you get something called Vodun, or voodoo, which is its common term, a highly syncretic religion that's still practiced by many, many people, by tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands, in both the island nation of Haiti and then in areas surrounding the Gulf of Mexico. So there is syncretic Catholic Christianity. There is also Islam. This is an image of an Islamic imam by the name of Mehmet Yarrow. And Yarrow was a person of some prominence in his society before he was kidnapped. When he's kidnapped, he winds up in Philadelphia. And at first he's enslaved for a number of years. Then he gets his freedom and becomes this kind of elder statesman for various African communities in Philadelphia. He's highly literate. He is a scientist. He's an intellectual. These are all characteristics that came with him, things that he possessed, even as his body was being stolen out of Africa. And he is really one of the first Islamic thinkers that we have in the New World. These are called cowrie shells, and cowrie shells are both found in profusion on the West African coast, and they're also found in the Chesapeake. And in doing archaeology in places around the Chesapeake and the Carolinas, we find huge concentrations of these cowrie shells, which had religious significance to a group of people called the Ibo, and the Yoruba people of the west coast of Africa. So we see the transferal of religious practices across the Atlantic, enduring the horrors of, I'm sorry, it's Yoruba, enduring the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade, and then persisting in the Americas. So this diversity of religion really opens up a mirror into the lives of African people that we often have to get from artifacts. These were people who were often kept from literacy. So they were kept from leaving their own records. What we do have are artifacts, and we need to try to read those artifacts wisely to reconstruct as much about their lives as we possibly can. Some of those artifacts also come in the form of resistance to slavery and what we can conceivably know about people when they act and when they try to, as Frederick Douglass called it, steal themselves out of slavery. This is often the best insight that we have into the material worlds of the enslaved. So I'll read you one of these. I'm sure some of you have encountered these in high school classrooms because they're really amazing teaching tools, and they help us to at least get a little bit back of this world that was lost by keeping people from literacy. So this is the escaped ad of 4 men of color, and their names are Lester, Isaac, Mingo, and where is the fourth one? Caesar. So this, just by knowing their names, it tells us a whole lot about them. First of all, Isaac is a biblical name. That was most likely, it was very common to rename people in slavery. And that's a particularly insidious way of claiming mastery over someone, or claiming that you own them. I own you, so I'm going to give you a new name. It doesn't matter what your name was before, what your identity was before. So Lester, Caesar, and Isaac clearly have all been renamed or told that they need to use these names. Perhaps it's more appropriate in enslavement. Mingo speaks to people of the Windward Coast. So there's a possibility that Mingo's name refers to his point of origin in Africa. Caesar is a particularly sad relic of how enslavement worked. It seemed to amuse literate slaveholders tremendously to give the people that they owned names out of classical antiquity as a way of showing how much they knew and how literate they were. And wasn't it kind of funny that an enslaved person was named after a Roman emperor? So that in and of itself is an insight into the slaveholder himself and the insidiousness and the wanton and pleasurable cruelty of slavery by taking someone and mocking their state by giving them a name that means the exact opposite. But what else can we tell about them? Okay, we can tell that Lester had white flannel jacket and drawers, duck trousers, and homespun shirt. That means by 18th century standards, he was actually pretty well dressed. He's not wearing the kind of tatty clothes that we might associate with enslavement. And this gives us some insights into slavery in the North. He has comfortable clothes, he's kind of good clothes. We don't really know the state of them, but flannel and duck and even homespun aren't kind of the rough, crude Osnaburg fabric that you would associate with slavery in the South. Um, Also, Mingo and Isaac are wearing the same clothing, and it seems like all four of these men have run away from the same man who is William Bull. And he is offering quite a significant reward if he can get information leading to the recapturing of the people he claims as property. He's also making a threat that anyone who takes these men aboard a ship will be prosecuted. And this also tells us something about the knowledge of the enslaved and how determined they were to escape. Often ships could not leave their ports unless they had a full complement of sailors. They needed as many hands as they could get or as many hands as the size of their vessel needed. So enslaved people who had some capacity to get aboard a vessel would get aboard a vessel, and they might end up in London. They might end up in some other European capital where they can then leave the vessel and hope to conceivably reestablish their lives. Remember, slavery is not very popular, and there are very few rules governing it in Europe. So here's an opportunity to get away from the people who enslave you, and hopefully will forget about you and give up the chase. William Bull, the slave owner here, is saying, I know what might happen. I know they might try to get aboard a vessel. And if any one in charge of one of these vessels takes them aboard, you could face serious trouble and be prosecuted. You might find this escaped slave ad very interesting because note the subscriber, a man by the name of Thomas Jefferson. And of course, we're going to encounter Thomas Jefferson very, very shortly. This ad was placed in the late 1700s, and it's for a mulatto slave called Sandy. So a mulatto would be a person of mixed heritage, of part African heritage and part European heritage, might also be part Native American, but it's usually half African and half European. And we can learn a lot about the way he looks, that he was rather short, that he was kind of chubby, that he was light skinned, that he knew how to make shoes, and that he was left handed and could also do carpenter's work and could also ride horses, that he was a horse jockey. And that is not a skill that everybody has. So it makes me kind of wonder if he was chubby, why would he be such a good horse jockey? But there you have it. That he enjoyed having alcoholic beverages, and that when he was drunk, he let people know that he was dissatisfied by his status in life, what Jefferson calls insolent and disorderly. One might call your tongue loosening up and speaking for your desire for your freedom from this state of life. That he swears, and that he's also very clever. He took a horse, which would have been an expensive piece of equipment, um, and Jefferson is no doubt angry about that. And that he would probably try to get as far as away from the horse and then maybe sell it. Carried his shoemaker tools and would hopefully be able to get to a place where he could live his life as a shoemaker. Why might he want to do that? Because in addition to slavery existing in the North, there are also large populations of people of color who are not enslaved. So clearly this man, Sandy, is trying to join them. And again, Jefferson wants his property back, and he signs his name very boldly and offers a 40-shilling reward, a good double of what this William Bull is offering for information on four people. So clearly this is extremely important to him. We'll talk about Jefferson more during the course of the semester, his tremendous um, uh, uh, hypocrisies, and the fact that he had children with an enslaved woman, what we can make of that. Thomas Jefferson is probably my least favorite founding father among a population of people who were extremely complicated and who were revered for a long time and are now being historically reevaluated. We'll certainly do that during the course of the semester. We're moving away to have a discussion about colonial government, and it's very important that you understand it as a prelude to the American Revolution. So, there are a few things that are characteristic about the way these 13 colonies and the others in the English Atlantic world are governed. And one of them is that these colonial governors of each individual colony report back directly to England. There is really no overwhelming or unifying force in the colonies. Their relationships are directly with the mother country. So that means when things start to go kind of south with the mother country in the 1760s and they lead to the American Revolution, these colonies are really going to need to think in terms of connecting with one another to present a unifying response. Indeed, each colony refers to itself as its individual country. And that's kind of the way the colonial world is set up a bit. But we're going to look at these two men here are representatives of colonial governors. And these men, of course, look very fancy and wealthy. They are drawn from the elite classes back in England. And here's the story. You would become the governor of a colony because you were a friend of the monarch, aka the king or the English king or the English queen, and they would give you the governorship of a colony. And you would come over to that colony and you would preside there representing the king and representing the colony at the same time. But there's a real twist to this. Each colony had its own legislature, a little elective body of the wealthiest land-holding white men of the colony, and they would be allowed to make local rules for each colony. Here's where things get really interesting. They paid the colonial governor. So the colonial governor was given this wonderful potential plum from the English monarch, where they could make a lot of money and amass a lot of land and commercial farms if they were inclined. But the catch is that the little local legislature in the colony is the governing body that actually pays them to be governor. So here's the issue. England creates a law in regard to its colonies, and the colony doesn't really want to follow that law, or the colony's flouting that law. Do you, as the colonial governor, obey the monarch and make sure that law is followed, or do you instead tell your king, I know what the law is, I know what my duty is, but I can't quite enforce the law at this time. It's really not possible. Most colonial governors will do the latter thing, both to preserve their income from being colonial governors. They're going to want to play nice with the legislature and play nice with the colonists. And also because it's not like they have some sort of army to back them up. To back up the king's wishes. They don't. So they really are subject to what the colonists want. And just like the consumer revolution, which raises the level of material life for the colonists, the same thing is going on with these colonial governments. They actually have a good deal of freedom. It's a minimum of 6 weeks to England each way to get a ruling on a law that isn't being followed. And then when that ruling happens, who's going to execute it? The colonial governor is a one-man show? No, the legislature will just ignore him. So, what does a colonial governor do to get everything he can get out of the experience of being a colonial governor? He plays nice with his legislature and the colonists. When this relationship starts to break apart, it's yet one more thing that is going to lead to tensions that amount to the American Revolution. Let's talk about a topic called the Enlightenment. And hitherto, I've spent some time talking about religion as a real driving force, and religious beliefs, chiefly Christian ones, come in the form of Catholic Christianity, which is pretty unified under the Pope in Rome, and then under multiple Protestant Christianities, which are all kind of splintered off and different, but they are just but they are unified in is not being Catholicism. And that is really a prevailing idea until we get to kind of the early years of the 18th century, when new lines of thinking are going to start. A lot of them are still going to say religion is still important, but they're going to say other topics are kind of equally important. And one of those would be the place of man in, or human beings, I should say, in society, and in regard to leadership and what human beings should be able to expect, something called natural rights, which was promulgated by a thinker named David Hume, and then carried forward with the three thinkers that you see here. So those thinkers are John Locke, a man with so many French names, it's hard to keep track of them all, but he is known kind of commonly as Voltaire, a French Enlightenment thinker, and then Benjamin Franklin here. So what does the Enlightenment stand for? The Enlightenment stands for increasing human rights. It should be known that the humans they are talking about are generally males of European origin, or possibly, affluent females. But John Locke, for example, while writing about the natural rights of man, is a chief investor in a British slaveholding company. So there you have a big contradiction there. But it's an increasing of human rights, white, European chiefly, increased belief in science, and the scientific method. So how you can use an experiment that can be replicated to show that something is a fact. And that's where Franklin comes in. He is the great darling of the Enlightenment and of Enlightenment science, and of the perfectibility of human beings when allowed to govern themselves. Oops, not govern themselves, govern themselves through education. So education in both Protestant and Catholic Europe is going to grow tremendously in the 18th century as some of these Enlightenment ideas, many of which are not antithetical to religion. Indeed, Benjamin Franklin himself thought that religion was a good thing, basically kind of for human control and hope reasons, but he was a promoter of religious belief. That education was really key to being able to govern oneself, and for leaders to be more in the service of human beings rather than being their overlords. These are some of the key ideas of Enlightenment thinking. And what Enlightenment thinking really does is kind of shift the focus from God being the center of the universe to the human being being the center of the knowable universe. These ideas are extremely exciting, and it's really part of the consumer revolution that brings books and ideas from the old world, from places like London and places like Paris and places like Amsterdam, where Enlightenment thinkers are producing and then publishing their ideas. That consumer revolution that is bringing those cheap goods to the Americas is also bringing books, is also bringing reading materials, is also bringing new ideas. And Enlightenment ideas are really going to puncture a hole into the colonial intellect, where people who have the luxury and education to be able to understand these ideas are going to imbibe these ideas and try to build them into their relationships with local leaders, and with the monarch back in England. And it's not going to have terrific results for that monarch when the Americans rebel and say, based on these new ideas of what you should be doing for me, I've decided you're not doing enough, and therefore I am going to govern myself. So that is kind of a key Enlightenment takeaway that also connects to the idea of the American Revolution. So let's talk about the prelude to the American Revolution, and that's something that we're going to see on this slide here, the 7 Years' War. And again, I'm kind of switching topics, but I'm bringing out some big changes of the 18th century, which is interesting to study in its own right, but is going to have this great apotheosis of the American Revolution toward the end of it. So you see here a snapshot of what the Americas look like in around 1750. And here is the story. First of all, the French claim on a map everything that is blue, and that ranges from Canada in the north, going all the way into the Great Lakes region, into modern-day Ontario, Manitoba, and Alberta, coming into the Great Lakes, what is called the Illinois country, the entire valley of the Mississippi, and ending in what is called La Louisiane. Now, here is the catch. Most of the people, the really powerful people living in most of these regions are Native American, and they cooperate with the French as they see fit. But there are very few French settlers. There are French forts and French soldiers all throughout this region, and they have built alliances with Native people. But there are not settlers. Indeed, by the time we get to 1750, there are only about 30,000 people of French birth living in this entire region. In this region here, the kind of salmon-colored region, there are 1.5 million people. So as you can see, that is a huge difference in numbers. 1.5 million people of European origin versus about 30,000 in all of this region. What's really remarkable about this story to me and to other scholars is the fact that since 1690, the French and the English have been at almost constant war, both back in Europe and in their colonies. And the small population in French Canada has beaten back or held at bay the English every single time. How do 30,000 people do that? They do that by having very powerful allegiances with Native people, and also by sending over, as their chief settlers, soldiers. And that's not the case in most of these colonies. People come in family groups, and they are going to suffer terribly at times of tension between the English and the French in their respective colonies. But the English do manage to hold their own. The French idea here would have been to deeply populate this region that is the home of Native people, of French Catholics, and of Native people married to French Catholics that formed this kind of strong phalanx of New World people who could eventually push the English out into the sea. And if the French had succeeded at their plan, folks, we might all have different passports and different driver's licenses. But they don't. And that ultimate failure of the French New York plan is New World plan, pardon, is going to happen with the last conflict between the French and the English, known as the 7 Years' War. And the 7 Years' War spans from 1754 to 1763. Okay, so just before you believe Chmielewski can't do arithmetic, very basic arithmetic, because that is indeed 9 years instead of 7, the actual precipitating event to this last of a sequence of wars between France and England in the New World starts in 1754 and doesn't become a generalized conflict until 1756. But it's the first of these conflicts to really happen here. And who was responsible for starting it off? George Washington. And you might say, that's odd. I've learned a very different story about George Washington. Well, we're going to encounter a story of George Washington's young life, which is going to then affect the rest of his career as both a military leader and a leader in general. So let's look at that. And I'm going to stay on this map for a moment to set this up, and then we're going to move on. This map shows a little piece of territory here, a state that we know of as West Virginia. But in the colonial period, it was just part of Virginia, and it came right up against Pennsylvania. And this area was contested for a very long time between Virginia and Pennsylvania. Indeed, Pittsburgh, this little nascent city, which was strategically very important, was claimed by both colonies. But both Pennsylvania colony and the Virginia colony are deeply concerned about the fact that the French are really reinforcing their power here in what is called the Ohio Territory. This is really, really rich farmland. And a lot of colonists from Pennsylvania and Virginia and other places would love to be able to move into this area and open up new farms and be successful colonial people who could then send their raw goods back to England and then receive those cheaper goods. It's the cycle we talked about with the consumer revolution. And yet the French are moving more aggressively into this region, and they are conducting frontier raids with their Indian allies against settlers and killing whole families and taking captives and burning farms. And this is very concerning. So in 1754, a militia unit under a relatively young, recent graduate of the surveyors program at the College of William and Mary, a very wealthy plantation owner by the name of George Washington, is going to set off into the West. And what is he going to do? He is going to challenge the French for primacy in this Ohio region. So he will get together a militia unit. They will march and develop a defensive position in the Ohio territory very close to Fort Jumonville. And they are going to say, hey, this is our territory. How are the French and their Indian allies going to take that? Not very well. They will attack Washington's forces at the little fort that Washington builds called Fort Necessity. It's not going to help him that 1754 is a remarkably rainy late spring, which means that his firearms don't work and his men become very sick with pulmonary diseases. Everybody's cold and damp and miserable. Their own native guides are going to leave them for more convenient quarters, and also because they're not being paid and they're not being fed. But it really touches off this last conflict. This conflict is different from others in the sense that it starts, first of all, in the New World instead of the Old World. All the previous ones started in the Old World and spilled off into the New World. This one isn't like that. It starts in the Ohio Territory, and then the French back in France get mad at the English, and it becomes a more generalized conflict. Some people say it's actually the First World War, where you have elements of this conflict on the west coast of Africa. You have them as far west as India and in islands off of the coast of China, known as the Philippines and Macau. And then, of course, you have this New World part to it. But it's important to our story because the English had previously let the colonies defend themselves against the French. And they've said, okay, you take care of yourselves, you protect our interests, you don't cost us any money to protect you, and you know what? We'll turn a blind eye to your trading practices, which are often smuggling, but here's where salutary neglect comes into the picture. In the 7 Years' War, however, the English and the French decide to send over professional fighting forces from their respective mother countries to settle these conflicts once and for all. The English are going to send over multiple regiments, trained regiments who will connect with these little local armies called militias, which are paid for by individual colonial legislatures. And the French are going to do the same thing. Two things result in the French losing their North American colonies. Thing number one is that the professional French soldiers who are sent over during the 7 Years' War do not have the same ability and they don't have the same desire to build allegiances with Native American allies. They don't understand how this relationship has worked. And they completely muck up, if you will, these long-standing relationships where Native people fought with the French when it suited them, and they got tribute and presents and bounty for doing so. And it was with the understanding that if they didn't want to fight, they didn't fight. They had their own reasons for fighting. And the French who were on the ground in New France and Louisiana and the Illinois Territory all understand that. But the professional French fighters do not. And in effect, they insult and they abuse their Native American allies, making them very ineffective. In addition, the English will send over their extremely well-trained fighting forces who will do some pretty daring things to conquer French Canada. The first thing they do is in 1759, they succeed first in laying siege to what's considered the impregnable fortress of the city of Quebec, which is really the heart and the soul of the French New World Empire and is one of the pinch points of the St. Lawrence River, which is the gateway to all other French claims. The English are going to basically blockade this city, which means they're going to have an array of sailing vessels and fighting men right outside the city. But the French basically kind of give them the finger and say, you know, how are you possibly going to scale the high walls that this city is based on? You're not going to be able to scale them. So the heck with you, we're safe here. Well, what happens under the cover of night in the summer of 1759, the English do scale the cliffs of the city of Quebec. And when everybody wakes up in the morning, they find out the English are there. A battle ensues in which both the French general, a man by the name of the Marquis de Montcalm, and the English general, a man by the name of James Wolfe, are both killed. And yet the English forces prevail. They succeed in taking the French administrative, spiritual, cultural, symbolic capital of Quebec. 1 year later, Montreal falls, and Montreal was the seat of New World economic riches for the French. That is the seat of the Fur Empire. And they will succeed in taking Montreal, and they will put a powerful pinch point both on the St. Lawrence River right here, that gateway to everything, and on the French economic system in the New World. 3 years later, because it takes a while for these things to pan out, the French are going to be willing to come to the bargaining table with the English. So before they had all of this purple territory here, by 1763, this has all become English. The French had basically given up their New World empire in North America to the English. Why would they be so willing to do so? Well, first of all, the fur trade was nice, but the fur trade wasn't nearly as lucrative as sugar. They have claimed several Caribbean islands that produce sugar. They want to keep those islands. They bargain away all of North America before with the opportunity of doing that. Indeed, one French king had dismissed the American colonies as, quote, a few acres of snow. So they don't really think highly of what their New World empire can do. They were basically hanging on to it because they were checking the English. But now that the English have taken their major cities, have taken their major river, which was a highway into their heartland, they are willing to come to the bargaining table. And they see the best thing for them to do, economically that is to retain the sugar-producing island of Saint-Domingue right here and give away this whole New World empire. The English and the English colonies are thrilled with this. They have basically now made Canada their own New World empire. And oh, by the way, through some quirk of administration, the Spanish are given a huge chunk of what was the French New World, what had been called La Louisiane, which we call the Louisiana Territory. That will go to their Spanish allies, who kind of walked a neutral line in this conflict. So a tremendous chunk of the French New World goes to the English and basically protects those border lands here that had been under assault by the French for decades, for almost a century. And then the Spanish are going to add a big chunk of territory to their New World empire. And that is going to be the state of things in the critical year of 1763. We will pick this up with next week's lecture when we explore the origins of the American Revolution.